Let's start with BRICS summit. It was so interesting. How did you find it?
Well, I think it's cryptic at this point. I think the most important thing is that BRICS is opening up 5 new members by January 1st, 2024. 20 members waiting in the wings, waiting to be let in. 50 members total, sort of waiting, considering. The important events will be when Turkey, which is a NATO member, decides to join. That's the point in time when you can say that, well, the West is really crumbling and rats are abandoning a sinking ship. So that's probably the most important thing. Other than that, the usual topics of discussion were de-dollarization, how to price things without recourse to the US dollar, and various vague notions of common trading currencies. But for now, the techniques of trading using national currencies are just going to be perfected and made more widespread and possibly unified, where China has its own system, Russia has its own system. So there are a lot of discussions about whose is better and how to join them together, how to make things interoperate better. And so that's probably the scope of it. But the stunner is that the existing BRICS nations do less than a third of their trade with each other in US dollars at this point. So the dollar is down and out.
If we compare the system we have now in BRICS to that of G7, we see that we have 7 countries. The political system in these countries are the same. We cannot say they are literally the same, but they're so similar. The political system is this neoliberal system of politicians are in power in these countries. But when it comes to BRICS, we have a diversity. We have China, we have Russia, we have South Africa, Brazil. They are so different in many ways, culturally, traditionally. Diversity can be a great challenge to find a common ground, to cooperate. How do you see that?
Well, I think diversity at this point is a dirty word. People should stop using it. And basically means kind of like a random assemblage of things. Russia and China and South Africa and Brazil and India are not random. They're different civilizations that have made contact with one another and have learned how to deal with each other as equals, which is something that G7 members are as far away from as you can possibly imagine, because they're all slaved to the United States. And the word is slaved, as in slavery. Their political systems are not the least bit independent, nor are they economically or culturally independent. And all of the cultural diseases that blow in from the United States mostly, and at this point from Western Europe as well, they cannot throw up barriers against them as China and Russia have done, and as India is in the process of doing. So basically, we're talking about sovereign nations versus an assemblage of non-sovereign non-nations, you could say. And the reason BRICS is so attractive, the reason such quote-unquote diverse countries as Saudi Arabia and Iran, most recently enemies until they realized, where the future lies, are joining, is because this pretty much guarantees that they'll be allowed to develop their own way and to remain themselves and not have some alien system of thought or government or commerce imposed on them by some faraway master. That's what makes BRICS so attractive.
Yeah, that's why I'm talking about this diversity, because we have China and India together. There is some challenges between them, between these two countries. Now we have Saudi Arabia and Iran these countries were literally had no relations before. Just 2 months ago, they started their relations. It's so amazing how Russia and China are bringing these countries together. I think their role is so important in this coalition that is happening right now.
Well, if you notice, SCO has both Pakistan and India as members. And that was an interesting moment when they were basically both trying to cram themselves through the door of the SCO, kind of all at the same time, you first, no, you first, no, you first, and finally jamming themselves through the door together. But SCO has been functioning with both Pakistan and India on board. And I don't know what it's done to their relationships, but their relations with all the other SCO members seem to be fine, seem to be functional. So this new mode of basically not trying to coerce each other into the same worldview or the same set of policies is actually working quite well.
Lula at the BRICS Business Forum, he said that we cannot accept a green neo-colonialism that imposes trade barriers and discriminatory measures under the pretext of protecting the environment.
There's a group of quote unquote British scientists. The term is now kind of a derisive term, because it implies that these are not scientists at all. Well, basically, there are these scientists who call themselves climate scientists, and there's no such thing. There's geophysics, but they call themselves climate scientists because they have these computer models that they've concocted that predict this or that. Of course, they predict whatever it is that will get them more money for their research. So what they predict is a major disaster, and B, a major disaster that will allow their masters who fund them to tax CO2 emissions, or so they hoped. And now the whole world is waking up to the fact that these models are faulty. They're no better than weather predictions a month out, and probably worse. And they have huge holes in them, like they can't really model cloud cover. And water vapor in the form of clouds is the most important greenhouse gas there is. And methane is second, and CO2 is kind of a trace gas. It's plant food, so it's essential, but it doesn't really figure that much. Plus, the oceans are a huge CO2 sponge, so everything depends on the temperature of the oceans. When they warm up, CO2 effervesces out of the water like it does out of warm beer. And when they cool down, then the oceans absorb CO2 again. This is kind of a breathing that happens planet-wide. So basically, these climate models are crap. And the more people realize that, the better. CO2 is not important. Anthropogenic emissions are not important. What's important is solar cycles, orbit of the Earth, and we're looking at the next ice age within the next 1,000 years or so, maybe less. So that's something to worry about, not CO2 emissions. So the fact that Lula actually said it out loud is very helpful.
And the other thing that he mentioned, that said conflict in Ukraine showed that the limited functionality of the UN Security Council.
Well, first of all, there's the UN, which basically stipulates what sanctions are, and they have to be approved by the UN Security Council in order to be legal. Sanctions imposed unilaterally or by some club of nations in circumvention of the UN Security Council are illegal. So the sanctions that the United States and the European Union have imposed on Russia as a result of what they saw as Russian aggression in the Ukraine are illegal. And in that sense, the Security Council is useless and toothless because it has been bypassed. And in general, countries like the United States ignore international law and the UN Charter left and right. So he's right. The UN is not very useful at this point.
South African president, he mentioned that said we are concerned that the global financial system is increasingly being used as a tools in geopolitical competitions. Do we know any experience of the South Africa considering this issue? Or he's talking about other countries.
Well, yes, South Africa has been basically on the receiving end of a very nasty treatment by Western interests, American, British, who bought into its electricity sector, resulting in major blackouts in many parts of the country and shortages of electricity and high electricity prices. So that is an example of the financial system being used to apply leverage to South Africa in order to force it to do the bidding of certain Western countries. And South Africa is basically a prime candidate to get rid of that influence, but it has a lot of industry that's owned by foreigners. So that's an unfortunate effect. And it probably doesn't have the political power to nationalize all of that and kick the foreigners out. So it's in a difficult predicament.
Do you think that these BRICS countries can expand political and security cooperations to maintain peace and tranquility?
Well, I think that they can be very helpful in terms of freeing commerce from political constraints and of providing support for developmental models that do not have to be synced up with what the West wants. And they can be very helpful in freeing countries from the necessity of basically sending all of their savings to the United States in the form of buying up US federal debt. All of those things are very useful, and all of those things are probably very conducive to peaceful coexistence. I think that basically both the United States and the European Union, which are the two sets of countries that dominate G7, I think that they can be brought to heel very easily, because you see they both run trade deficits of about $1 trillion a year, and they're shrinking in terms of the size of their economy relative to BRICS, where BRICS is now larger than G7 economically, amounting to more than a third of the world total, whereas G7 is now less than a third of the world total. So basically, to fight a war, you have to have some kind of a winning strategy. People who decide to fight a war, they generally don't aim for defeat. Whereas any sort of a war, cold or hot, at this point fought by the G7 would be self-defeating. In fact, what they should probably do is basically just stop trying to be offensive towards other countries.
In your opinion, what is the greatest challenge that BRICS is facing, these BRICS countries are facing right now?
Absorbing so many countries all at once, that's a major challenge. Basically, it's an organization that can very easily get mired in bureaucracy, where nothing gets done, where basically there's a lot of talk and very little action because everybody's pulling their own separate ways. So I hope that this gets resolved by basically segregating the overall activity into certain areas, like how to develop a useful common yardstick for pricing things that doesn't depend on the U.S. dollar. How to set exchange rates so that all the countries can develop well without running trade deficits with each other. All of those things are macro issues that can be set as targets. And if these targets are pursued, then that will create a reasonably waterproof, tight framework for accepting new members. So that's really what I'm hoping for.
They want to have a unique currency to be used by all members, or it's going to be a basket that accept all the currencies?
I think none of the above. I think a yardstick but to which rates can be set as opposed to currency pairs is very useful. How it's defined is up to economists and econometric models. It's a complicated issue. It doesn't have to be a currency. It's just a unit. It's like the meter or the kilogram. It's it's nonsense to talk about trading it or borrowing it or stealing it. It's a unit of measure. That's all it is. And then if that unit of measure exists, and if there's a way to resolve trade imbalances, say by shifting gold reserves between countries, if trade imbalances develop, then why not just trade in various countries' currencies, and there wouldn't even be the need for currency conversion. Basically,
At
central banks would just be transparent go-betweens between currencies that are mated up in this manner.
How do you see the power of sanctions imposed by United States and generally by G7 countries?
What effect do sanctions have on Russia? Quite favorable, I would say, very helpful. So there's a saying in Russia, more sanctions, please, because basically these sanctions are a way for the EU and the United States to hurt themselves and to help Russia. There used to be a lot of trade between the West Bloc and Russia, and the end result of that was a lot of money, a lot of profits that were made in Russia were expropriated and sent to offshores, invested elsewhere, and Russia suffered as a result of that. It basically produced a lot of stuff. It made people a lot of money, but a lot of these people were foreigners, and because there were no barriers, that money just drifted back out of the country. So that was a kind of a neo-colonial model of development. But thanks to sanctions, there's been a kind of financial curtain dropped on Russia. It became impossible to get investments, return on investment out of Russia. It all ended up in rubles and ruble accounts in the Russian central bank. There wasn't an easy way to move money back and forth because of limitations on SWIFT. So money stopped leaving Russia and being invested elsewhere. And then various sanctions on Russian oligarchs made them wake up and realize that there's nothing for them here and pull out their wealth out of the United States and Western Europe and bring it back to Russia and invest in Russian businesses, making them thrive. And then a huge wave of import replacement where Russia is now making a lot of the stuff, such as medicine, for instance, such as machine tools, that it used to buy abroad from G7 countries. So basically, the sanctions have been very helpful to Russia. Russian economy is now growing. Russian trade deficit is zero. Russian or positive actually. Russian budget deficit is zero. Things are just beautiful in Russia, and that's all thanks to sanctions.
These 6 countries, one of them is Saudi Arabia. Its role in petrodollar is so crucial and important. We cannot ignore that. How the United States is understanding this movement of Saudi Arabia? Do you think they're gonna pressure Saudi Arabia?
I think they've already tried that, and that ended disastrously. They sent Biden over there, and he was laughed at and ignored. Came back with nothing. They tried various other openings and overtures with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran opening diplomatic relations was a nightmare for the Americans. It just threw all of their plans into complete disarray. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran now being admitted into BRICS is another disaster. So the United States is lurching from one disaster to the next. Already, Saudi Arabia is selling lots of crude oil to China for yuan and not for US dollars. And then there's the fact that, this is not related to Saudi Arabia directly, but Russian crude oil, the EU imposed a limit of $60 a barrel on Russian crude. And the Russians said, okay, that's no problem. And they went ahead and invested in a big tanker fleet, 400 or 500 ships, tankers, that now deliver Russian crude around the world. And guess how much they charge for the crude? $60 a barrel. And guess how much they charge for the transit? However much they like. And guess who owns that fleet? The Russian government. So sounds like Russia is pretty happy with $60 a barrel crude, given that it charges for the transport.
If we consider this coalition in BRICS between Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, these are the main energy hubs on Earth. This cooperation can make a huge power for BRICS.
Well, yes. Well, basically, it links up BRICS with OPEC plus. OPEC plus is already a fairly tight-run organization that can click its heels and suddenly the price of oil goes up. But that's and now that Saudi Arabia and Iran are joining BRICS, there's another channel of communication open between them that allows for even tighter integration of energy policy between Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. These are the 3 largest oil exporters in the world. Now, that's only the beginning, because the largest oil producer in the world right now is still the United States. It's just that they burn all of the oil they produce and then some. And that's going to end abruptly when shale oil runs its course. Shale tends to deplete very fast. So shale oil came on stream very quickly. And within the next 3 to 5 years, it'll drop just as precipitously. And then the United States will be forced to either shut down most of its economy or start importing copious amounts of oil from countries that no longer accept dollars. So the United States will not be able to print some dollars and use them to buy oil anymore. It'll actually have to sell something in order to buy something real. So what does the United States have to sell in order to buy oil? Well, there's farmland. What else is there? There's everything in the Metropolitan Museum of Art could be auctioned off. Beyond that, there isn't really that much left that the United States can liquidate in order to keep its trucks and trains and airplanes flying and running. So that's going to be a major problem for the United States, and it's coming up in just a few years.
in this war, we had the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline, which disconnected the pipeline between Russia and Germany. In long term, it's going to be a huge problem for Germany, because it seems that Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, that they can sell their gas and oil to China, to India, because they need a lot of gas and oil. On the other hand, Europe is a big loser of this game in Ukraine, in this sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline, because they don't have sufficient gas and energy. If they receive it from United States, it's gonna be much more expensive. This pipeline that we've discussed before, that comes from Norway to Poland, is not capable of providing the level of gas and oil they need.
Well, basically, the fact that Germany doesn't have access to sufficient quantities of Russian gas anymore has forced it to shut down a great deal of its industry. Car making used to be a very large part of the industrial sector in Germany, and now it's been supplanted by China. Germany also had a lot of chemical industry, making fertilizer, making paints, making lots of industrial chemicals. That also had to be shut down. Basically, there's a wave of bankruptcies and shutdowns sweeping through Germany, and is going to have a huge political problem with unemployment. But unfortunately, it has a government that is just completely out to lunch. I mean, if you look at Scholz and Baerbock and people like that, they're just completely incompetent and out of touch, and their only function in life, as far as I can tell, is pleasing their American masters. And given that their American master is currently a senile, incompetent man who wasn't very smart to begin with, they're assured a very bad result. And the poor Germans just they don't know what to do. They're out of practice in terms of running their own affairs. They have turned them over to the Americans a long time ago, and now the Americans are failing, and they don't have anyone on their side.
It seems that we're going to have some political changes inside Germany, because people are against this government, this Scholz government, and they want to have an alternative. How is that possible to have these changes in Germany?
I don't know how it's possible. I really don't see anything useful coming together there, at least not for a while.
Because we already had
It's
that
going to
change
be
in
very conflicted.
this far right change, Meloni, that came in power in Italy. It didn't change anything, literally anything. She's
That's right,
totally,
because the governments in Europe don't control anything anymore. They've surrendered their authority to bureaucrats who can't do anything either.
is that possible that the United States makes some challenges between China and India?
Oh, it's possible. Is it probable? I don't know how probable it is at this point, because it's like how possible it is for a very stupid person to provoke a fight between two very smart people, because that's really the situation now. The United States is now internally rudderless, and its foreign policy amounts to doing the same stupid thing over and over again, stepping on the same rake again and again. It's so corrupt that it can't do anything that will stop enriching its defense contractors and all the people who are basically in the defense contractors' pockets, which is most of the politicians, national politicians. So what can it do? It really can't do much. The mischief that it tries to sow can now be seen from very far away. Everybody is wise on to them, and and paying careful attention. And the other problem is that, the Americans have this tendency to telegraph everything they're going to do before they do it, and then they go ahead and try to do it, somehow thinking that the people on the other side don't know what they're trying to do, and they do that over and over and over again. Um, I think their resources at this point are quite limited in terms of sowing mischief around the world.
How do you see the situation right now in Ukraine?
It just goes on and on. At some point, the Ukrainians will run out of everything. The big difference is not on the battleground, but behind the battleground in the Ukrainian rear, which is that the Russians have decided to go after the ports and the railways that have been used to deliver armaments to the front, and destroying Ukrainian forces deep within Ukrainian territory using rocket strikes. They have been quite sparing so far, but now they have really turned up the heat on that, and very successful in their spying operations. Apparently, there's a Russian spy in every Ukrainian village and town at this point, like half the country spying for the Russians. So the Russians know exactly where everything is, where everyone goes, etc., and their targeting is spot on. Every big gathering of mercenaries, for instance, pretty much gets destroyed by pinpoint rocket fire. They have gotten so good that they have been blowing up trains full of artillery shells while the train is moving. Really spectacular drone footage shows one railroad car full of artillery blowing up, and then the fire spreading to the next and the next and the next. And so that's happening. The other big change is that the Russians have gotten very good at blowing up Western donated armor, where it doesn't even get to the Russians' defensive lines, but gets blown up somewhere and off in the distance. So the Ukrainians have gained nothing, and as far as any action on the front in the north, in the Kharkiv region, the Russians are advancing again and regaining the territory that they surrendered in an effort mostly to create a defensible front line. They did that about a little over a year ago. That was a successful tactical maneuver, but the strategy, I believe, hasn't changed, and I think the next step will be to take over Kharkov altogether.
Odessa, Nikolaev.
Oh, they can wait. So far, the Russians are. Those two are important because they give the Ukraine access to the Black Sea. Well, that access is through ports, and the Russians have destroyed those ports. So they can wait on those. And Kharkov, on the other hand, has been used to launch attacks on Russian regions further north, Belgorod region. So they're quite likely to take over Kharkov and some of the neighboring northern Ukrainian regions, all the way to the Kiev region, perhaps, first, and then do a final sweep and sweep up Odessa and Nikolaev. But I think things events will unfold faster now that the Ukrainian military has been pretty much bled dry. They recently threw their perhaps their last well-trained, well-equipped combat-ready unit at the front with no effect. And their general tactic of throwing new green recruits at the Russian defensive lines has not worked at all. They've recently allocated a plot of land near Kiev for a new military burial ground cemetery, enough to accommodate something like 200,000 dead. They're running portable crematoria that the Germans have donated to burn bodies of the dead at the front or near the front, because they have no other way of disposing of them, I suppose. And the stench from that is people say is quite repulsive. What else is going on? Oh, the Russians have really ramped up their drones, their attack drones, kamikazes, for killing tanks and Ukrainian armor. So basically anything that moves anywhere near the front line just gets wiped out. So that's pretty much all that's going on. Everybody is just waiting for the Ukrainian front to crumble.
How do you see the possibility of Poland getting involved directly in this war in Ukraine?
I don't think that there's a huge chance of that at this point, to tell the truth. The Polish politicians had great designs, and then they got slapped really hard by both Russia and the United States, basically told to mind their own business. And so I suppose what they're going to do is mind their own business.
How do you see what happened to Prigozhin just yesterday?
Oh, his plane crashed. And not just he died, but also Utkin, who is his Prigozhin is kind of a figurehead, but Utkin was actually a commander in Wagner. In fact, his radio handle is Wagner, which is why Wagner is called Wagner. It's because of Utkin. They're both dead, although that hasn't been confirmed yet. The forensic evidence hasn't been confirmed yet, but they were on the manifest for the flight. The plane crashed. According to flight radar, it was maintaining some reasonable flight corridor, and then climbed rather sharply, and then stalled and fell. So could be something as stupid as decompression on the plane, and everybody passed out, and the plane climbed and then stalled and crashed. So that seems reasonable. In terms of how it's going to affect Wagner, well, to some extent it will, but you have to understand how Wagner is organized. In terms of setting its goals, it's an absolute dictatorship, and it takes orders from the Kremlin. In terms of how it pursues those goals, how it decides how to act, it's a complete democracy. There are no ranks. It's a flat system. And then in terms of how it actually meets those goals, achieves those goals, it's again an absolute, complete totalitarian dictatorship with absolutely strict discipline. So, what is a commander in that instance? Well, somebody who was picked to be a commander. Well, what if the commander dies? Well, you pick somebody else to be the commander, and that's all that happens. So I wouldn't make too much of this. There are a lot of conspiracy theorists doing their theorizing now. I don't know that that's useful or interesting. That's just a personal thing. I'm not enthusiastic about that sort of endeavor.
Because in mainstream media, just how they see these events looking at that mutiny by Prigozhin, when that happened, everyone was talking about, oh, look at Putin, he's weak, he cannot do anything. Then the mutiny stopped and everything went the way the Russian government wanted to be. And now his death shows that Putin is weak. Everything coming out of Russia shows Putin is weak.
Well, that's silly, but the mutiny, the quote unquote mutiny, which was taken care of within one news cycle, was actually very useful within Russia internally, because there's a contingent of people known as turbo patriots who are all eager to second guess Putin's decision making, badmouth the Ministry of Defense and the generals, and are all in favor of the country basically declaring all-out war and blah blah blah. Of course, most of them don't do anything at all. They just sit on their asses and complain on social media. But there's an election in Russia next year, and it would be very good to know who these people are and neutralize them ahead of time, so that they don't cause mischief or embarrassment during what promises to be a kind of a very boring election cycle in Russia, in spite of all that's going on. And so what the Prigozhin thing did was flush them out of the bushes. And so that was a very useful maneuver. And so there's zero chance of the turbo patriots of mounting any sort of opposition that stands any sort of chance. And that's a good result.